I nevertheless want to welcome all of you warmly. My name is Dick Pass, and I'm the provost here at the University of Scranton. The president, Father Joseph Allen Panuska of the Society of Jesus, is out of town today, and so I bring you his welcome, as well as my own, and the greetings of the university community. We're delighted to see all of you here tonight in what is the last in the Judaic Studies program lecture series for a very busy year. It's only about a month ago that we successfully concluded a scholarly conference that took an awful lot of work and about which we're very proud. And of course, we're delighted tonight and honored to be able to have speaking to us such a distinguished man as Norman Podhoretz. Norman Podhoretz is the editor-in-chief of Commentary Magazine, a position he has held since 1960. He's the author of 6 books. I'm sure you're familiar with the titles. Among others, The Bloody Crossroads, Where Literature and Politics Meet. Anyone from an English department will understand that. Why We Were in Vietnam, 1982. Present company accepted, of course. The Present Danger, 1980. Breaking Ranks, a political memoir, in 1979. Making It, 1968. Doings and Undoings, 1964. Mr. Podhoretz, in addition, has written a nationally syndicated weekly column. He has contributed articles and reviews to most of the major American periodicals. He has lectured at many universities and before many civic and religious groups on foreign policy, American culture, literary matters, and Jewish affairs. He has appeared often, as I'm sure you know, on radio and television. A native New Yorker, I understand from this evening, a native of Brooklyn, really. Thank you, Seymour. Former neighbor of Seymour's, Mr. Podhoretz was a Pulitzer Scholar at Columbia University, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in English from Cambridge University, where he was Fulbright Scholar and a Kellett Fellow. He also has a bachelor's degree in Hebrew literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary and has been awarded honorary doctorates by Hamilton College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Yeshiva University. Mr. Podhoretz is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also chairman of the New Directions Advisory Committee of the United States Information Agency from 1981 to 1987. He is listed in Who's Who in America and Who's Who in the World, and we're looking forward to hearing him speak tonight about the Middle East peace process. It's an honor to present Norman Podhoretz.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I love kind introductions because they're pleasing in themselves, but they also give me a chance to tell one or two of my favorite Jewish jokes. I usually tell them anyway, but if they follow the right kind of introduction, I can segue more naturally into them. And, one of them is about, some of you may have heard this, it's a classic, is about a Hasidic Rebbe on his deathbed, surrounded by his disciples, his Hasidim, who are weeping and wailing, tearing their garments at the imminent loss of their beloved teacher, leader. And one of them says, "Oh, woe is us. How will we survive the loss of our Rebbe? He is the most learned man in the world, and who will teach us Torah when he is gone?" And the second fell to weeping and wailing and said, "How will we survive the loss of our Rebbe? He is the most virtuous man in the world, and who will set us an example of good conduct when he is gone?" The third took up the cry and said, "How will we survive the loss of our Rebbe? He is the wisest man of the age, and who will show us the ways of wisdom when he is gone?" And they wept and they wailed, and the old man, with the last ounce of strength in his failing body, lifts himself up on his elbow and it says, and about my humility you have nothing to say. I noticed that nothing was said here tonight about my humility, which I am famous far and wide. That's probably the last laugh you're going to get out of me tonight, so enjoy it, because I come here with grim tidings. You know, the day that the famous handshake on the White House lawn between Yasser Arafat of the PLO and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of Israel, I was invited to Washington to observe the proceedings from the television studios of the Israel Broadcasting Authority, or whatever its formal title is. The idea was that we were to sit there watching it and comment, sort of the way a color reporter does on a football broadcast, I guess. And Abba Eban, a man whose political views are very different from mine, known him for many years, was supposed to be the other side. Eban did not show up on time. I joked to the moderator that was because while he would be very happy to shake Yasser Arafat's hand, he certainly would be happy to shake mine. In any event, because Eban didn't show up, they changed their plans, and instead of having a live running commentary, the host decided he would interview me on tape and run it after the proceedings were completed. So I said that was okay, and we sat down in another room and they ran the machine. And he said to me, well, how did you feel about the handshake? And I said, it was morally disgusting and politically stupid. And he was a bit startled by my delicate phraseology. And he responded by saying, but after all, don't you have to negotiate with your enemies, and don't you have to take risks for peace? And I said, yes, perhaps, but as I see it, what is happening here today is not establishing the foundations of peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. It is establishing the foundations for another war. And when he challenged me to explain how that might happen, I said there were two possible scenarios. I said that what I thought Arafat was doing that day was carrying out what is known in the Arab world as the phased plan for the destruction of Israel. This is a plan that was originally developed by Bourguiba, who was president of Tunisia, and who took the view that the Arabs would never be strong enough to destroy Israel militarily, or even if they were strong enough, the United States would never allow this to happen, so that they had to pursue a strategy of phases, of stages, and in which they could gradually achieve the objective of the destruction of the Jewish state, which they regarded as an abomination and an intrusion into an area that should belong to them and to Islam. And the phased plan called for the seizing by any means, whether political or military, of some part of the land that was originally called Palestine, which of course includes the current state of Israel as well as the so-called occupied territory. Getting a foothold in some part of that territory, and using that foothold to advance gradually toward, again, through political means, perhaps through some military means, but gradually to get the Israelis to yield to the point where a new Palestinian state would be established. That would be stage 2 or stage 3. There's not enough time to map this strategy out in precise detail, but that's the idea. You begin with a bit, and then you move forward. And I said that if this were to happen, and it seemed to me clear that this is what Arafat was aiming for, that the new state would immediately be riven by factional strife and eventually civil war between the PLO and the radical Islamic fundamentalists, with another party loyal to Jordan and another party loyal to Syria, and you would have a process similar to what occurred in Lebanon, the Lebanonization of the new Palestinian state, in which different militias would be murderously at one another's throats. And just as happened in Lebanon, this would bring about intervention by the Syrians, who consider the entire area, and that includes the state of Jordan, not just the state of Israel, but Jordan and the whole territory claimed by the Palestinians, and Lebanon as southern Syria. That's what they call it. And they regard those territories as ultimately, as belonging to them, and which must ultimately fall under their rule. So the Syrians would intervene. The Israelis would find this an intolerable threat, would have to respond to that intervention, and there would be, a war would break out between Israel and Syria. And then I predicted, I'm still now responding to the Israeli television host's questions, there would be an assault by the combined Arab armies, along with Iran, who would forget their own internecine differences in order to join together in this final jihad, in this final assault, holy war against the Jewish state. And if Israel were to lose, God forbid, if Israel were to lose such a war, that would be it. That would be the end. Israel would be wiped out as a political entity. If Israel, on the other hand, were to win, it would ironically find itself reoccupying all the same territories from which it would have withdrawn in the first place in order to achieve peace. But the price of that reoccupation would be very bloody in an age of missiles and poison gas and high-tech weapons. The price of blood on both sides would be enormous. That was one possible scenario. I said another possible scenario might be that the territory from which Israel withdrew would be established as a base for a very aggressive terrorist campaign against the Jewish state. And at some point, the Israelis would have to respond to that by hot pursuit, and the same scenario would then unfold: Israeli intervention with Syrian reaction this time, and the outbreak of a horrible war. That's what I saw coming out of this handshake that everybody else was so euphoric about and so enthusiastic about. When I finished with this, the host said, "Thank God we weren't on live," because there you would have destroyed the day for everyone in Israel. Well, we were not on live, and I said, well, I assume you're going to broadcast it at some point. He said, oh, yes, it'll be on later tonight, but of course it was never broadcast, as I discovered upon inquiry. Nobody wanted to hear that kind of thing said at that particular moment. Now, of course, my highly pessimistic view, which was rejected by most Israelis at that moment, and rejected overwhelmingly by most American Jews and almost everyone observing the scene who was interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict. That pessimistic view stood there, unpleasantly clouding the otherwise brilliantly blue sky of optimism that was shining over this entire episode. The great exponent, the most optimistic of the parties was not Yitzhak Rabin, who, as you may remember, was very reluctant to shake Arafat's hand, and kind of shrank back and looked quite disgusted and unhappy about the whole thing. But Shimon Peres, the Israeli foreign minister, was very enthusiastic and has continued to be enthusiastic. He sees this as the beginning of a new era in the Middle East, a new Middle East in which everyone will get together to make money, not war, and in which all the countries of the region will help each other develop, and in which the Middle East will become another model of economic prosperity like Singapore, Taiwan, those so-called tigers of Asia. I can, instead of trying to paraphrase, I think I will quote what the editor of the Jerusalem Post, David Bar-Ilan, said the Israeli government at that point was asking the people of Israel and the people of the world to believe, and this was the optimistic scenario, that the Palestinian state, incidentally, the Israeli government to this day denies that it is in favor of a Palestinian state, but no one believes it anymore. I mean, I didn't believe it from the beginning, and I don't think anyone believes it any longer. That is, that the Palestinian state will inevitably be the outcome of this particular negotiating process. So that the new Palestinian state will form a benign, business-oriented confederation with Jordan, that with open borders, 150,000 Arab workers will enter Israel every day, and satisfied with seeing their flag in Gaza, Hebron, and Nablus, will forget all the catechisms of hatred and revenge they have been taught, and will work peacefully in Israel. That the very same chieftains who fathered international terrorism will from now on change course completely, apprehending and hanging Islamic fundamentalists, heroes and martyrs of the glorious Intifada for the sake of the Israeli infidels. That the 1948 Palestinian refugees and their offspring, who for 45 years have been kept in squalor with promises of reclaiming their homes, will now be satisfied to relinquish those claims. That Syria, once it has regained the Golan, will start disarming, throw out the Palestinian rejectionists it has been harboring, and disband Hezbollah, one of the terrorist rejectionist Palestinian organizations. Syrian youth are becoming democratic, said Paris recently. Soon they will not tolerate a dictatorial government. And Bar-Ilan goes on, Israelis are being asked to believe that Iraq, Libya, and Iran will realize that they too have a stake in peace and stability and will cease fomenting unrest in the Arab world. In short, as Paris announces, at every opportunity, it's a new Middle East. Well, this is a very optimistic scenario indeed. So optimistic that it defies credibility. Nevertheless, Rabin and Paris are so committed to some such scenario that they are determined to let nothing stand in the way of its unfolding. Nothing. Not the fact that the PLO has yet to deliver on its commitment under the Oslo Agreement to abrogate the clauses in its charter calling for the destruction of Israel. You know that the PLO operates under the Palestinian National Covenant Charter, and there are several clauses in that charter openly calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. One of the things Arafat agreed to was to abrogate those clauses, reasonably enough. But he has not done so, and not even in fact attempted to do so. The reason mainly being either he doesn't want to or he feels he doesn't have the political power to get his people to agree. Nothing is being allowed to stand in the way, not that. Not the fact that Palestinian terrorism, far from being brought to a halt, which was also agreed to in the Oslo Declaration, has intensified. It has claimed well over 100 Israeli lives since the handshake on the White House lawn. That is more than in any year during the Intifada, during the Great Palestinian Uprising, and indeed more than in any year since the establishment of the State of Israel. And it is bad as it is, the toll would have been much greater, if several terrorist attempts had not failed. And they failed no thanks to Arafat's police, who were put in Gaza to keep the terrorists in check, but either because of incompetence or because of Israeli intelligence operations. They won't be stopped by the fact that both the PLO and the Syrians have denounced the peace treaty Israel has concluded with Jordan. And not the fact that Syria, while announcing its willingness to make peace, continues arming itself to the teeth. Continues arming itself to the teeth. Evidently, the Syrians don't agree with those Israelis and Americans who poo-poo the need for territorial buffers in an age of missiles, because Assad's own missiles, and he has a formidable arsenal of them, have not lessened by one whit his determination to recover the Golan Heights. Now, all this is pretty much what I expected when I delivered myself of that horribly pessimistic scenario on Israeli television. I also, conversely, expected that a certain amount of progress would be made in the relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And some progress has been made. As I just mentioned, Israel has concluded a peace treaty with Jordan. Some of the Gulf states have opened diplomatic relations with Israel. The international community, particularly in the UN, has stopped its favorite pastime of condemning Israel every Monday and Thursday, as they say in Yiddish. The international community has become relatively benign toward Israel since the Great Handshake. The Vatican has improved its relations with the State of Israel. So there has been a certain amount of progress, and even the Syrians have on and off again, off again, made noises about making peace with Israel. And the reason that I expected things like this to happen is that it seemed clear to me that once Israel set out to do what everyone had been demanding of it for 25 years, which is to withdraw from the territories it captured in the Six-Day War and allow a Palestinian state to be established in its wake, no one who didn't openly espouse the destruction of Israel, openly espouse it, would have any justification to refrain from entering into better relations with it. And as for those Arabs and some others who still secretly, or not so secretly, hope to wipe the Jewish state off the map, well, they could bide their time while the first stage of the phased plan for Israel's destruction, to repeat, consisting of the recapture by the Palestinians of a part of the territory now occupied by Israel. They could wait while this first stage was being implemented, and conquest of the rest of Israel could be deferred to further stages down the road. Well, if all these developments, the negative and the positive, have struck me as predictable, I have to admit that I've been surprised, very surprised by two things. First of all, by the cooling of Egypt toward Israel. Egypt, until the peace treaty with Jordan, was of course the only Arab state that had made peace with Israel. It was what came to be known as a cold peace, because relations remained very frigid. The Egyptians have made no effort, they haven't made war on Israel, but they've made no effort to establish the kind of cordial relations that a normal peace between neighbors might suggest. While Israelis have tried to come to Egypt as tourists, Egyptians have not gone to Israel. Egyptian children are still taught blood-curdling lies about the Jews, the protocols of the elders of Zion, that classic anti-Semitic forgery, which came out of Tsarist Russia, circulated in the millions in Egypt, and in general, the animosity toward Israel and the anti-Israel propaganda has, if anything, intensified in recent years. Nevertheless, I thought Egypt would soften after the handshake, and the Egyptians have not softened. They've been making a great deal of trouble for the Israelis. They have even they've made trouble with Washington over Israel's refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's a highly technical issue. I won't go into it, but that's one thing they've done. But the most extraordinary thing from my point of view was what they did at the conference in Morocco that was called This was supposed to be the beginning of this great new Middle East that Shimon Peres talks about, in which there will be wonderful economic cooperation between all the states, among all the states in the region. The Egyptians came to this conference, it was only some months ago, I forget exactly when it was, with a 90-page book of proposals for regional economic development. 90 pages, there were many proposals. In this book, there were 5 maps. I've seen them with my own eyes. I'm not reporting on the basis of hearsay. There were 5 maps of the region, some large, some small, you know, this part of it, that part of it, illustrating the areas in which this kind of economic cooperation might take place. Not on a single one of these maps was Israel, did Israel exist? I mean, there was no Israel on any of these maps. They show the existence of Israel, and the name of Israel was not mentioned in the 90 pages of this booklet. Well, I don't know what that says to Shimon Peres about the possibilities for regional economic development when Egypt, of all countries, which you would think would be first and foremost in rushing to cooperate with the Israelis on economic development, still refuses, in effect, formally and officially to acknowledge the existence, or even the existence of Israel on maps that it itself draws for an international conference. That's one thing that surprised me, the deterioration of relations with Egypt. The second thing that has surprised me is the amount of terrorism that the Palestinians have perpetrated since Oslo. Now, I did not anticipate a complete end to terrorism. That was unrealistic, but I did think there would be much less of it than there's actually turned out to be. And the reason I expected so much less was a grisly maxim that has been attributed to Ernest Bevin, once British Foreign Secretary, who is said to have remarked that a reasonable amount of blood would have to be shed, a reasonable amount of blood would have to be shed before a certain agreement that the British had entered into could be broken. Well, how much Jewish blood would be considered reasonable in this case? In other words, how many Israelis would have to be murdered before the public rose up and demanded that the deal be called off? No one could tell. My mistaken guess was that 100 would be more than enough, but the Palestinians knew better. They surpassed 100 and are still going, and nothing has been called off. I thought that Arafat would be clever. I mean, if I were advising him, I would have advised him to go slow and not provide any excuses to the Israelis to protract their withdrawal or even break the agreement. But they are not following that strategy, and it has occurred to me that Arafat may have been influenced here by the agreement on Vietnam that was negotiated in 1972 in Paris by Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho of Vietnam. And Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho got the Nobel Peace Prize for that agreement, just as Rabin, Peres, and Arafat got a Nobel Peace Prize for the agreement that they concluded in Oslo. Now, under the Paris Agreement on Vietnam, the United States began a gradual withdrawal of its troops from Vietnam. And during that period of withdrawal, certain conditions were supposed to be observed by the North Vietnamese to ensure the peace and the continued independence of South Vietnam, which was part of the deal. Well, the North Vietnamese repeatedly violated those conditions, but never to the point of provoking the United States to reverse course. On the contrary, the violations served to increase pressure on us to get out. And once we did get out, Hanoi mounted a full-scale invasion that did indeed bring peace to Vietnam, South Vietnam, the peace of the grave. The country South Vietnam no longer exists. Now, the analogy isn't perfect. The Palestinians are not as powerful as the North Vietnamese were, though in combination with other Arab states, they might well be powerful enough. And the Israelis aren't as weak and demoralized as the South Vietnamese were, though by the time this peace process is completed by their withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders, they will certainly be more vulnerable to attack and possibly more demoralized than they are today. Even so, the tactics of the Palestinians are strikingly similar to those that were used by the North Vietnamese after the Paris Peace Accords. For that matter, Palestinian negotiating tactics in general bear a remarkable resemblance to those of the North Vietnamese, which they characterize as fight and talk, simultaneously, fight and talk. And this, I think, brings us to the interesting question of the relation between the PLO and the Islamic fundamentalists of Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, there's no doubt that a serious political rivalry exists between the mainly secular radicals of the PLO and the Muslim fundamentalists of Hamas. Nor is there any doubt that they will become embroiled, as I earlier suggested, in a bloody struggle for control of the new Palestinian state once it comes into being. But for now, the two groups are in a strategic alliance to get the Israelis out as quickly as possible by means of a fight and talk campaign, with Hamas doing the fighting and the PLO doing the talking. It is simply not true that all the terrorism is being perpetrated by Hamas with the PLO sort of helplessly looking on and trying to oppose it. In fact, there was a recent editorial in the Jerusalem Post that put the case well. It said, there is no real conflict between the PLO and Hamas. The PLO may go through the motions of arresting Hamas functionaries, but if there is one thing about which there is no disagreement among Palestinians, it is that only the armed struggle has forced Israel to recognize the PLO and agree to a withdrawal from the territories and the eventual establishment of a Palestinian state. They believe that more armed struggle will spur Israel to make more concessions and faster. Now, after the horrible bombing of the bus in Tel Aviv last October, you remember when more than 22 people were killed, Arafat, probably for fear that 22 dead and twice as many injured might finally add up to a reasonable amount of Jewish blood, finally expressed his regret at a terrorist act. But Farouk Kaddoumi, who bears the title of Foreign Minister of the PLO, had only weeks earlier declared, quote, "No one can complain about what Hamas and Jihad, Islamic Jihad, are doing. I say that it is the right of every Palestinian to struggle so long as there is a single Israeli soldier on the land of Palestine." This comes not from an Islamic fundamentalist leader, it comes from the foreign minister, high official of the PLO. And as the Jerusalem Post commented, it is these words rather than Arafat's regrets which reflect the PLO's true sentiments. Even now, we've been reading in the papers since the latest bombing a week or so ago, in which 7 Israeli soldiers and an American tourist, American girl, were killed. We've been reading about a crackdown by Arafat against the Islamic fundamentalists. But that too turns out to be mostly for show. I noticed just yesterday in the New York Times, a newspaper that has been very supportive of the peace process, there was a remarkably honest report by its correspondent in Israel, Clyde Haberman. I also noticed that the Times buried this story on the bottom of an inside page, hoping that very few people would see it. I myself almost missed it. And what Haberman reports, it's interesting. He says, tensions have reached new levels between the PLO and the fundamentalists after the latest suicide bombings by Muslim radicals, twin attacks in Gaza this month that killed 7 Israeli soldiers and a visiting American student. With his political future on the line, Mr. Arafat needs Israel's agreement to expand his authority beyond Gaza and tiny Jericho to the entire West Bank. The Palestinian leader declared it was time to get tough. Though cheered on by the Israelis and the United States, he carried out his most intense crackdown to date, arresting 300 suspected extremists, demanding that guns be registered, and convening military-style courts to sentence Islamic figures to prison terms. 8 men have been convicted behind closed doors, the latest being 2 Hamas men who this weekend were given terms of 7 years and 4 years, respectively. However, says Haberman, campaign of arrests has produced rage among the Muslims and fueled threats of a civil war, at the same time, the parties, that is the PLO and the fundamentalists, have labored in private meetings to keep the situation from spinning out of control. They have reached no settlement, but even without a formal truce, it is clear no side wants to push the others too hard. The Islamic groups have kept their angry words to just that, words. And after an initial show of force, Mr. Arafat has freed most of those arrested, a familiar pattern, while being careful not to put senior Muslim figures on trial. So this latest so-called crackdown is also mainly for show. Well, where does this all leave us then? As I see it, we're sitting through a three-act drama, a three-act tragedy. The first act began in Madrid in 1991, when then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir of the Likud party, not of the Labor Party, agreed to join in an international conference to negotiate on a peace settlement. That meeting in Madrid led to further negotiations, which took place in various cities. That was the first act. And it ended on the White House lawn nearly 2 years later with that world-famous handshake. In the second act, on which the curtain hasn't yet fallen, we're still in the midst of the second act. The processes set in motion by the first act have been working themselves out. The plot is unfolding. There's been a glitch here and a small surprise there, but on the whole, the plot has unfolded exactly as it was designed to do. Barring some utterly unforeseeable twist, this act will end with the Israelis returning to the borders of 1967, perhaps with some minor modifications, with the establishment of a Palestinian state, in all probability with East Jerusalem as its capital, leading to the redivision of Jerusalem, and the signing of a treaty between Israel and Syria involving the Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights. Act 2 may also include scenes of conflict between the Israeli government and the Jews living in Judea, Samaria, and the Golan Heights, who will resist being expelled from their homes. Now, the settlers living on the West Bank, that is in Judea and Samaria, have been demonized by not only the present government, but most of the Israeli intellectual class and the Israeli media as enemies of peace, as right-wing extremists in general, as fanatics, counterparts to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And they don't command an enormous amount of sympathy, I think, in Israel. The Jews living on the Golan Heights, a different story. Most of them were supporters of the Labor Party. Most of them voted for Yitzhak Rabin in the last election on the theory that he was a tough, hawkish guy who would never surrender the Golan Heights. In fact, that was one of his campaign promises. He said he would never go down from the Golan. Incidentally, I remember the first time I was taken to the Golan shortly after the 67 war when it was captured, and being told by an Israeli general that we can never leave here. And when you look at the security situation there, the vulnerability of this Israeli settlements living below and of the Galilee in general, you can understand why. And for 25 years, Israeli governments, and Labor as well as Likud, left as well as right, all said that the Golan, Israel could never leave the Golan. Its security depended on staying on the Golan. And yet here we have an Israeli government evidently prepared to do just that, to surrender the Golan. And the people living up there, who've done, by the way, a marvelous job of developing the area, built a whole new city and all kinds of industries. And again, I was there not long ago, very impressive what they've done. are naturally in a rage, and they feel betrayed by Rabin, to the point where you can hardly see a tree or a rock that doesn't contain some ugly piece of graffiti against Rabin, really ugly stuff, because they feel so betrayed. And they also have a good deal more sympathy, I think, among the Israeli people in general than the settlers on the West Bank do, so there may be more difficulty in concluding that deal with Syria to the extent that it involves a full Israeli withdrawal, and also to the extent that it involves the placement of American troops there as a guarantee of the arrangement. Many of us oppose that idea, and there will be a good deal of angry debate here in Washington if that proposal actually comes onto the table. But despite these complications and despite these conflicts, if there is a lot of trouble, I mean, including some actual armed conflict, I mean, Jews against Jewish soldiers, Jewish settlers against Jewish soldiers, if it comes to that, my own feeling is that the conflict will be resolved through a combination of bribery and coercion in favor of the government. When I say bribery, I mean money to give you so much money to leave, you'd be compensated, and coercion in the form of soldiers actually dragging people out. And those territories will become free of Jews under Arab rule, Judenrein, if you like. This is how I see Act 2 concluding. And it's only in Act 3 that we will discover whether Peres and Rabin are right in their optimistic forecasts. Whether Peres is right in prophesying that a new Middle East will emerge out of this series of events, in which peace will serve as the foundation of a regional prosperity rivaling that of East Asia. To the less lyrical Rabin, the new Middle East will be a place where Israel, separated from a restive and angry Palestinian population it is neither willing nor able to control, will, for the first time, be able to enjoy peace with all the surrounding Arab states, and will, for the first time, enjoy real security. Now, if this optimistic forecast is right, then the names of Rabin and Peres will go down as a blessing in the annals of Jewish history and in the annals of world history. But if, as I believe, they are blinding themselves to the true radicalism of their enemies, who are not enemies of peace, as Israeli doves like to say, but enemies of Israel, people who have not made their own inner peace with the existence of a Jewish state in that region, no matter where its borders are drawn. It's very important to understand this. The making of peace does not involve the signing of paper. As Henry Kissinger likes to point out, peace agreements mean nothing because all wars break out between nations that were previously at peace. It doesn't guarantee, the agreement doesn't guarantee that there will be no war. What guarantees real peace is when the parties to a conflict decide to give it up, make their peace inside with each other. In this case, it would be a question of the Arabs saying, okay, we tried, we failed, it's not so terrible, let there be a Jewish state. We thought it was contrary to the will of God, we thought it was an abomination, we thought it was an aggression, we thought it was an act of injustice that there should be a Jewish state in our region. But okay, we'll reconcile ourselves to it. We will make our peace with it. Let it be there. Because for most Arabs, it hasn't been the borders of the Jewish state, nor what Israel did or failed to do about refugees or this issue or that issue. It's been the very existence of the state of Israel that has constituted the crime. Not the actions of Israel, but its existence. And therefore, no actions of Israel could satisfy the felt grievance of the Arab world. And I believe until Arabs do make their peace with Israel, there can be no peace. And that they have not made their peace with Israel seems very evident from to anyone, I think, who pays careful attention to what they say in Arabic to each other. If you read stories about demonstrations, bloodthirsty demonstrations that are carried on against not just Israelis, but against Jews as such, and the repeated declarations that they want to get rid of Israel. Of course, their diplomats don't talk that way when they speak English or French or speak to the Western world. They know better. But the sentiments that are rampant among the Arab masses and among Arab intellectuals as well tend still to be ultimately intransigent in their hostility to the existence of a Jewish state. So I think that the Israelis, partly out of war weariness, having lived their entire national existence in a state of siege, spending many weeks every year on reserve duty, having their lives interrupted, blasted, being condemned by the whole world, being treated like a pariah. I think out of their weariness, they seized desperately on a delusory, what they thought was an opportunity, but it was a delusory opportunity, finally to get out of this terrible bind. And I think Paris and Rabin, or Rabin and Paris, I should say, have surrendered. Paris enthusiastically, Rabin with some reluctance, to this delusion, and have now pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, their political future to this delusion. And if I'm right that it is a delusion, all hell will break loose in Act 3, and woe to the Jewish contemporaries of the government of Israel and their descendants alike. Now, in the past, left-wing, dovish Jewish critics of Israel often justified themselves by quoting highly selective verses from the biblical prophets about the glories of peace, as though it were the Israelis rather than their Arab enemies who needed instruction on this point, who needed to be taught that peace was a good thing. Now that I, having for a long time opposed public criticism of Israel for a variety of reasons by Jews, now that I found myself forced to go public with my own criticisms, I might as well go the whole distance and quote, and also quote from the prophets, and specifically from my own favorite prophet, Jeremiah. Jeremiah, on more than one occasion, denounced as false prophets those of his own day who cried, "Peace, peace, shalom, shalom," when there is no peace, ve'ein shalom. Peace, peace, when there is no peace, they cry, he said. On yet another occasion, Jeremiah declared with almost blasphemous audacity, "Ah, Lord God, surely thou hast greatly deceived this people and Jerusalem, saying, you shall have peace." Now the traditional interpretation of this astonishing verse in which Jeremiah seems to be accusing God of deceiving his people with a promise of peace. The traditional interpretation is that Jeremiah is blaming God here not for practicing deceit himself. Obviously, God could not practice deceit, but for failing to stop the mouths of the false prophets who were crying, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. Well, perhaps God never does stop the mouths of false prophets in the present. Perhaps the false prophets can only be definitively distinguished from the true prophets in the future, only in the future, when the argument between them over the direction of events will finally have been settled. As Jeremiah himself said in one of his many attacks on the prophets who saw peace ahead when he was beset by terrifying visions of war and devastation, he said, "The prophet that prophesieth of peace, when the word of that prophet shall come to pass, then shall the prophet be known that the Lord hath truly sent him." In Jeremiah's day, the word of these prophets of peace, consoling and popular though it was, and it was very popular politically, that word never did come to pass. Instead, just as Jeremiah had foreseen, the kingdom of Judah was destroyed, the temple was sacked, and the people were driven into exile. Well, I will conclude this little Jeremiah of my own by praying with all my heart and all my soul and all my might that my apprehensions about the so-called peace process now going on are ill-founded, and that those who tell us that peace between Israel and its enemies is only a few territorial concessions away will turn out to be the true prophets, and I the false.